Hi, welcome to Charismindful. I'm Dr. Amy Miltich.
I'm Matthew Hill.
Today I'm super excited to talk with someone who I think has a lot of knowledge about something that I'm really passionate about, and that is mental health and mental illness and how we, destigmatize mental illness. So today our guest is Sam Miltich. He's actually my second cousin. So he's on Zoom with us from Minnesota, and he's going to talk with us about his experiences in dealing with some mental health issues. So welcome, Sam. It's great to see you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me. Very glad to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, brother.
So Sam, we haven't actually met in person face to face, but we're second cousins and we're Facebook friends, which is kind of how we got to know each other.
Yes.
And I read on I've read several of your Facebook posts because you're very open, honest, very authentic and vulnerable about what's gone on in your life in dealing with mental illness. And so I just really want you to share some of that with us today so our viewers get an idea of kind of what your perspective is and also get a larger picture of what needs to be done about the situation. So if you talk a little bit about, what your experience has been and what your diagnosis is and how you were given that diagnosis when it started, I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah. So, I have my diagnosis is schizophrenia. I think it's like technically paranoid schizophrenia, but I was not initially diagnosed with that. I was initially diagnosed with depression with psychotic features. And the reason that it started out that way is there has to be part of the criteria for paranoid schizophrenia is you have to have ongoing symptoms for a certain amount of time before you're actually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, because it's a kind of a major diagnosis. It didn't take much longer beyond that, maybe 6 months, and I was in a partial hospitalization program. And I was diagnosed with what's called schizoaffective disorder, which is sort of a combination of a mood disorder like bipolar and a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia. Because people have psychotic events and they recover from them completely and they never have another one. And that can be a part of, psychosis can actually be a part of depression. Psychosis can be a part of bipolar disorder as well. So that's how my diagnosis began. It probably was after a couple of years that the diagnosis was shifted to paranoid schizophrenia.
I'm sorry, Sam. How old were you then?
Yeah, when I was first diagnosed, I was 22.
Okay.
So I had a psychotic break when I was 22 years old. That was pretty severe, is what I would say. And I completely lost touch with reality, and it became pretty clear that something needed to be done. I needed to get some help.
And was your family supportive? How did they react to it?
I would say that they were very supportive and loving, but without not a lot of knowledge about what was happening. Because at first it was like, why are you behaving this way? Why are you saying these things? What's going on? But then as things became more clear and the diagnosis came into play, it was like, whoa, this is a way bigger picture than what we initially thought of, just some bizarre behavior or
right, an episode,
yeah. So
yeah. And I'm not aware of any in the extended family, but are you aware, because I know it's a pretty genetic disposition?
Yeah. So schizophrenia and most mental illnesses are a combination of genetic predisposition for the illness itself, coupled with environmental experiences that can sort of flip the switch. Because some people may have the genetic predisposition for it, but they don't have. There's nothing that happens in life that throws the switch to them. I had some rather challenging experiences occur as a young person. I wound up, I guess you would call them adverse childhood experiences. I lost my brother when I was 11 years old, or I was 10 years old. And then we had a house fire about 2 years after that. And my dad's diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder he was a combat Marine, 1968 to 1970 in Vietnam. So there was a lot of underlying challenges in my adolescence. And I really kind of overcame a lot of that as a young adult and had a very successful career in music. But I think that those experiences, coupled with the stress that I was experiencing at the age of 20 to 22, um, a lot of stress exacerbated the symptoms, and it led to a psychotic break.
Wow. I mean, that's really fascinating. You have so much insight into it, Sam. It's impressive.
Oh, thank you.
You said we chatted on the phone briefly before our chat today, and you had mentioned that you've managed things pretty well since the diagnosis and with medication, and you've been, largely successful and, to use the clinical term, functional,
Yeah.
in society. So how do you think you've managed that? I mean,
Well, it's been a lot of hard work, is what I would say. And it wasn't always that way. I was not always as successful in terms of my functionality. When I was first diagnosed, I was not very functional. My ability to work, to play gigs, really wasn't there. I mean, I really needed to be in an environment where I knew what was happening. Traveling became exceptionally challenging for me, being on the road, staying in hotels or circumstances that I didn't feel comfortable in would exacerbate paranoid symptoms. And, I think to any kind of paranoia, I always think that there's a sort of a grain of truth that comes with it. There's sort of a reason for it, but the proportion to which people feel paranoid becomes so exacerbated that it's like a distorted picture. There might be a kernel of truth to begin with, but it becomes distorted and it's no longer, really true. I had a hard time grappling with the idea of taking medication long term. And so there was kind of a yo-yo effect of going up and going down on different medications. And I did wind up getting stable. And after I was 22, after about a couple of years, I really, by 24, 25, I was really pretty darn stable. And my musical career was going well. I kind of had this idea in my head that I had schizophrenia, but it really wasn't schizophrenia. It was just a phase of my young life where I was struggling like a lot of young adults struggle, And I thought, I'm past this. I'm doing so well. I decided to go lower on my medication, and it was just a mistake. And I wound up having a second psychotic break. So I say that I've had two chunks of, two psychotic breaks, and then 2 periods of really pretty relative stability and recovery. I think about it in terms of almost like the way, an alcoholic is in recovery, Yeah, right. Okay. So,
Oh,
all
yeah.
right.
Yep, that's me, brother.
Yeah. So, it's like when someone is drinking or abusing or whatever, and then when they're back on the path of recovery. And that's how I view my schizophrenia, is right now I would say I'm on a path of recovery. It doesn't mean that I don't have ongoing challenges to deal with, but I'm on top of it. It's not on top of me. So that's kind of how I personally think of recovery.
Yeah, what a great analogy.
That's a fantastic.
Really, I've never heard anybody characterize it that way or compare it with that.
I've been to 100 meetings in 4 months at least. So,
Yeah.
So I'm new on my path to recovery.
On it.
Yeah. Well, I had my brother-in-law said that he didn't mean it in a bad way, but he looked at me over my birthday and he said, you are two people, two different people, and I was like, that's me.
Yeah.
So so back to you, brother. This is fascinating.
Yeah.
And like how long from the time you decided to tone down your meds, what was that time space before the second break? Like how long did that last, or what was that?
Yeah, I would say like when I had my first psychotic break, it was more like, I think the glimmers of it happening sort of began when I was 21, but it wasn't full blown psychosis. There was like aspects of it that were coming into play,
Okay.
And then it probably took a year and a half from the onset of the spring of my 22nd year, probably took about a year and a half to kind of get stabilized. And when I was 30, when I had my second psychotic break, it was a similar timeline. It was like a year to 2 years to kind of fully get back.
Interesting.
And I think that's part of what can make that initial diagnosis so difficult, is because it's such a long, time span.
Yeah.
Mm.
And when you're in it, you look back and you go, well, a year and a half is not that long. But when you're in it, day to day, it's like,
I can't imagine.
it's brutal, you know what I mean? And so yeah, that's kind of the way it broke out.
And so once you got stable again on medications,
Yep.
second time after, so how did you kind of bring back your career and kind of pull things back together? Because you're pretty successful now.
Well, fortunately, the second time wasn't as severe, and it didn't require hospitalization. So honestly, what it really was I just kind of grinded it out, and I just kind of kept walking through the pain, and I was able to maintain my obligations and my commitments, which was good. Whereas the first time it happened, it was just like my whole universe exploded on me. And I think that brings up another point of resilience, and that need to continue to move forward, a day at a time. You combat the challenges as best you can, and you do what needs to be done, and then at the end of the day, you can go to bed saying, well, it might not be perfect, but I gave it my best try.
Yeah.
It's like, can I go to bed feeling honest about what I did today?
Right.
Did I do what I needed to do?
So where are you now with, symptoms and managing it day to day?
Yeah, well, that's a good question,
Is it
because
easier, or is it more of a kind of a oscillating?
more like the second, it's up and down, but I think that is something that is not unique to me. I think it's something that we're all experiencing in this current era.
Yes.
It's a hard time in American history. We have multiple challenges. We have COVID that's going on. We have an economy that's collapsed. We're dealing with racial injustice, and all of this stuff is coalescing all at once. And so I'm finding that I have to fall back even harder on my tools, and my coping mechanisms during this time period to cope and move forward. I've tried to, one of the things that happened is the past year I really dealt with some depression. It became clear to me it was more situational depression that surrounded some other physical health problems, but it had a mental health effect. That's
Sure.
one thing that happens. And I knew that I was struggling with depression, but I'm already on a mood stabilizer and on an antipsychotic. And I thought, you got to address the depression, but I really don't want to add another drug into the cocktail.
Right.
I know what these ones are. It's, it's the devil,
And it's a delicate balance.
Yeah, it is. It's a delicate balance. And I thought, well, I'm going to do everything in my power that's outside of the realm of pharmaceuticals to address it. And so I just put a ton of effort into diet and exercise and outdoors time and prayer and meditation, and it actually works. but the thing is, it doesn't work if you don't do it. So
you don't do it consistently, right?
Yeah, yes, exactly. You have to be really honest with yourself about, am I doing this? And that's like, for me, the process of writing something down and journaling about it at the end of the day, that helps me. Unfortunately, some things you may be able to resolve, but some things might not be resolved, and you have to accept that it may not be resolved, and that level of acceptance is part of moving forward, and the gratitude part is recognizing that I don't have to fix everything in my universe to still be well, because we can't.
Yeah, that's the good old, that's the serenity prayer.
Yes, it is, exactly.
With accepting the things I cannot change, courage to
Courage.
do things I can, wisdom to know the difference. Because I realize that there are some things that in my life that they're going to be a mess. I can't fold them neatly and put them away. And,
Yep.
And acceptance is a tough one, because sometimes I think sometimes people gaslight us with acceptance, where it's like, well, just choose acceptance. And it's like, no, this is not the way I want it to be. So it's that wisdom piece. No, I mean, just love your.
It's okay to say, I wish it were different, or this sucks. But right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's a really good term to say, that people gaslight you with that, because one of the things that I've realized is so much of things we have to come to it on our own time.
Yes.
It's not on someone else's timeline. And in terms of mental health, that's like a really important thing for family members to remember. Is I've done a series of presentations. In the state of Minnesota, we have what's called the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, which is there's a sales tax that's dedicated to, remarkably, the environment and the arts.
Wow.
And you can apply for grant funding for artistic projects. So Minnesota is a fantastic place to be an artist. The point being is, I have a program that I toured across the state called The Improvised Life. And it talked about mental health, recovery, and art, in particular jazz music. When I put that presentation on, there was so many times people would come to me and say, how do I get my family member to get help? How do I get them to take meds? And I would always say, unfortunately, you can't. You can influence them, but the path of recovery is their own decision to be made. And it's like, in addiction, the person who's addicted has to be ready for recovery. Another culture may view what we think of as psychosis as a pathology in a different way. It might not be viewed as a pathology. It might be just simply viewed as an alternative way of understanding the universe and how the world works.
Yeah.
And that there's a certain kind of depth and insight to that experience that these people have. And so one thing that's really fascinating is that people in traditional societies that are outside of the quote-unquote developed nations actually fare better, they do better than people in the developed world with mental illness, even though they have less access to medication. So it has more to do with the pressure that society puts on people with that kind of a brain, and how society reacts to people with that kind of a brain.
Yes. So, yes, fascinating. And I think you're right, which kind of leads me into another thing that we spoke about yesterday, was just the response when, things happened in Minnesota and Minneapolis with
Yes.
Lives Matter and George Floyd. You wrote a post on Facebook about dealing with, law authorities and law enforcement in dealing with your mental illness, and that there's such a great need for law enforcement to even have just a cursory understanding of what it is and how to deal with it.
Yeah, so I had a personal experience with it where this was when I was 30. This is when I had this psychotic event. And I'm okay talking about this. It's a little hard to talk about, but I'm okay with it. And I was suicidal, and I was very frustrated with people saying, you need to take your meds, you need to take your meds. So I thought, well, I'm just going to drive up into the woods, and I'm going to take all my meds, and I'm going to be done with this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to keep doing this. I'm sick of this merry-go-round. And
That's
so
very brave to say that.
I wound up, I was like in my mud boots and my bathrobe, driving in my car, and I'm up in the woods, and I find this abandoned old building, and the crisis intervention person calls, and
wow,
she talked me down, and she said, just please come home. I said, okay, I'll come home. So I got home, and she was there, but so was law enforcement. And so my wife talks about this. She said it was very clear which law enforcement officer was trained in mental health and de-escalation and which one wasn't.
wow.
And it was also, I'm not saying it's exclusively this way, but the officer that was trained in it and that was trying to de-escalate the situation was a female. and the one who was trying to escalate it, I mean, it was really pretty clear, was a male officer who pretty clearly wanted to take me down. and
Yeah.
and I mean, even in my psychotic state, I just looked at him and I went, if I do anything other than get in handcuffs, I'm dead or I'm really hurt.
Yeah.
I'm going to get tased or I'm going to get tackled or I'm going to get shot. One or the other.
Did he see you as a threat? Like he thought you were?
I don't know.
Be a threat? Yeah, I'm trying to understand why.
Because I think the deal would have, I think the issue was that if I would have resisted going with them. The one experience was pretty traumatic, to have your kids and your neighbors see you get drug out of your house in handcuffs and put into, a police car.
Yeah.
And that was my ride to the hospital, and then when I was at the hospital, you don't have a choice at that point about medication. You're just injected to calm you down.
Right. And they did kind of an involuntary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is really, to live through that kind of experience is, I don't know how you deal with it exactly. I just know that from my end of it, it was not fun. It was not a fun experience. And, but now, since then, our local crisis response team, stuff has changed. They actually now have funding to have a vehicle where people can be transported. That's not law enforcement. So it's an unmarked car. So there's not a stigma attached to someone being in a, because the implication is that you've committed a crime or that you're violent.
Right.
And the community sees that, and what kind of an impression does that give about someone with mental illness? There's the impression that someone with mental illness is violent, which statistically, we talked about this earlier, that people with mental illness have no higher statistical rate of violence than any other segment of the population.
Right.
And in fact, it's the opposite way around, because they are members of what would be called the vulnerable adult population. They're statistically more likely to be victims of violence than to commit a violent act. The sheriff of Beltrami County said, I'm running a mental health care facility and I'm not supposed to be doing that. He said the majority of these people do not need to be incarcerated. They need to be in a hospital. And he said the other thing is, we're not trained in psychiatric care, nor should we have to be. He said the people that are working for me aren't trained in administering psychiatric drugs, and they're doing that. These people don't need to be incarcerated, and it's actually a burden on our system to have that.
Well, and it doesn't give those individuals the help or support that they need either.
Right. And it perpetuates this system of incarceration. If I think, we're at a point now where it's happening within mental health as well, that we're moving towards, I think, a less stigmatized society and a more equitable and just society. And it's a work in progress always. But, here we are, we're talking about it. Whereas, when I was 22, however many 13 years ago, when that was happening, these conversations were not had. It was like, don't tell anyone you have this illness. You know what people are going to think. You know what people are going to say. All that kind of stuff.
Yeah. It's like you have to whisper the word cancer.
Yeah.
It was like, so-and-so has cancer. And my family, we have a history of mental illness. I finally decided that I would, after 52 plus years, go talk to someone about getting on some meds. And that was 4 months ago. And I can only say it's been a great success.
That's awesome.
And what occurred to me, as you were saying about the police are not able to deal with that, Amy is clinical director at a prison here in Tennessee. And when she comes home and shares with me what's going on, I look at her every week and I say that the prison system is the de facto mental health system, because we don't have, you can't monetize mental health in America, but you can monetize incarceration.
Right.
And, what a tragedy that is.
Yeah, and it is, and it's something that I feel lucky that I haven't been in that position, but I have cousins who have, who, one has bipolar, and he did wind up being incarcerated, was in prison, did prison time, and then, it was when he was having a bipolar episode that this happened. And when you become a felon in the United States, it changes the course of your life forever.
Yes, it does. Yes.
And I've watched him not just struggle with the mental illness, but struggle with the after effects of
having a record.
Yep, of having a record. How it affects your ability to vote, how it affects your ability to work.
Yes.
He's finally been able to, I'm not going to give his name, but I'm really proud of him because he's really created a wonderful life for himself. But the work that he's had to put in and go through to get to that point has been huge. And I'm extremely proud of him for what he's done, but I just feel like it shouldn't have been this hard.
Yeah.
Right. I agree. And I feel like sometimes the representation isn't good. There's so much of a stigma around mental illness. And I think so much is lack of understanding and lack of education.
Yep.
So they don't know how to defend it. They just don't understand it. So that's something personally I certainly want to improve on. It's, I like a challenge. It's kind of like swimming upstream, working in that system. But
well, and we're, it's interesting you talk about it because we have, that's changing here in Itasca County up here in northern Minnesota too, because now they're working with like what they call like an addiction court, where, when people commit a crime, they work with them in recovery instead of like in an incarceration role, and there's an accountability that needs to be followed for those.
It's almost like probation before.
Right. And so there is movement within the criminal justice system here in Minnesota to do those things. So there's becoming greater recognition of that.
Yeah. There really has to be.
And I think, as time goes on, across the country, that's just going to become, a larger part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely.
Hope so.
Yeah. So I don't know. I feel hopeful because, there are people who are working within the system like yourself. There are people I know within like the Grand Rapids Police Department that did do a mental health training. There's a training course that was developed in Minneapolis, and it was developed around a woman. It's in her name, who was having a bipolar episode. She was in psychosis and she was shot and killed. And so there was a program developed around training for law enforcement, and the Grand Rapids Police Department. You have to give credit where credit's due. I think the chief of the department had the people, take that course. So these things are happening. So there is social progress moving forward. And, I say now when I speak, I have to be careful about any resentment I hold, because a lot of it is past history. That's, things are getting better, Sam. You don't have to be angry all the time.
Right. It's a challenge.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. What an amazing story. I love your spirit. I love, we have to meet you now, face.
Yeah, totally.
For sure. I'm like, we do. Up, like, oh, there's Sam.
And your dad.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I appreciate you so much for being willing to talk about it and sharing your story. It's really brave. A lot of people don't talk about it. So I just, much respect and props for
and
that.
right back at you guys for taking the initiative to do this, because this is how it gets better.
It does. Yeah. I think it does. And this helps. It really, really helps. So
good.
Proud to call you family and friend.
Right on. Likewise. and nice to meet both of you.
Thank you, Tony. Or thank you, Tony. Sam. I got Tony.
Sam, no, it's all good.
Sam.
Dimensions the next episode.
Yeah. Short memory from excessive marijuana use.
That's all right.
That'll be it, Sam.
Okay.
You. Namaste, my friend.
Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you for stopping by. Hopefully we learned a lot. I certainly did from Sam. Wow. Amazing story. Our links to social media are down there. Links to Sam is down there. Share, like, subscribe. Do what you're going to do.
Check out our website.
Check out our website. This feeds your soul. We love you. And until next time, I'm Matthew. This is Amy. Bye.